And I know that it's 9:30 where you are, and I am deeply appreciative of you getting up this morning to spend a little bit of time with me. I'm honored to be with you this weekend for your General Assembly. Grateful for my friend whom I call Auntie, Nancy Talbot, whom, yes, I did get to meet because of my relationship with Ruby Sales and have come to love because of who she is. We're living in a strange time in our country. Not that we haven't been here before, but we haven't been here in this way for many of us in quite a while. And I'm not really talking about just the political charge of this moment, but I'm talking more about the growing tension between people, between our ability to see one another and hear one another and be with one another in ways that are unifying, in ways that are healing, in ways that call us to be the best of ourselves. I confess that in this moment, about 2 weeks away from our next election, I am more concerned about that in the church than I am about what's going to happen on November 3rd. And so I was grateful for Nancy's leadership and for the conversations with your planning team that led to this overarching umbrella of repairing the breach. There are many breaches in our society, and I'm certainly not about to sit here and try to tell you what you already know. We have racial divides, we have gender divides, we have divides over whom one loves and whom one doesn't love. We have divides over policy. We have divides over theology. This is not new in our society, but our intolerance of the other seems to be escalating in this moment of crisis, in this moment of being isolated from one another physically because we have been inundated with COVID-19 since about March in this country, I would say, in terms of isolation. And here we are entering, almost entering November, and we still have not been able to return to our regular ways of being. This may come as good news or bad news for some of you, but I don't imagine that we will ever return to our regular ways of being. That this time away on virtual platforms will change the way that we communicate as churches, as individuals, as a society. And that with itself brings some gifts and some challenges as well. Um, During my time, Nancy mentioned that I really became more of a public kind of person in the aftermath of the death of Michael Brown Jr. Michael Brown Jr. was an 18-year-old Black male who was killed in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, in Canfield Green Apartments. And I happened to be blessed to be one of the clergy voices that showed up in the streets with the young people. And I want to confess to you that my showing up in the streets with the young people did not happen just because I was this wonderful person who ran out not knowing what I was running into, but it really was born out of relationships that had been formed during my time pastoring in the region. During my time pastoring in the region, I began to notice that there were many changes in our neighborhood, many changes in our community. And I also began to notice that many of the people that I served as pastor were not aware of these changes. Most of them were not aware of the changes because they had originally lived in the neighborhood surrounding the church. That's how they became members of the church. But as time progressed, as families decreased or increased, as economic status increased, people began to move out of the neighborhood to other places where they chose to live. And I celebrate that. There's nothing wrong with that. But they continued to stay connected in the church, which meant that many were driving back to this community to worship on Sunday, for meetings during the week, and for whatever activities or engagements in teaching and learning that they were a part of in the church. But they did not live there. And their connection to the community remained located in the stories of their past, in the experiences of their past, in the times when they had physically been a part of that community all the time. They, in their minds, did not perceive a change from when they were the neighbors in that community to when they became the visitors in that community. And what that required of me as a new pastor, coming into a place that I could see with different eyes than they could see, was to convene our congregation on a Saturday to canvass the neighborhood they thought they knew. We spent a Saturday morning knocking on doors, visiting homes of people who surrounded the church now, some living in homes where former members had once attended. It did not take long for us to realize that the neighborhood had indeed changed. Even though the houses looked the same, the people occupying those houses now were primarily people who were renting and who were not owning their homes. Even though the school across the street was still functioning, the school that many of their children had attended as young students, the students in the school now were 85% free and reduced lunch. These things told us something about the economic status of the area, and it also told us something about the stability of the area, in that many of the people who were renting homes were people who rented frequently. And so the stability of the neighborhood was not the same as what they had known. And we decided after that day that we would become a neighbor to our neighbors, not just a church located in the center of a community, but a part of that community. And we decided we would do that in several ways. One of those ways was to begin sharing our stories with one another and inviting neighbors in to share their stories. Because I would suggest to you, my friends, the stories that we tell and the stories that have been told to us shape how we live our lives and how we perceive the lives of others. Those stories are told to us from our families, from our educational systems, from our social engagements, and indeed even from our churches. These stories help shape our opinions and our interactions with one another in ways that are deeply, not always challenging, sometimes affirming, but deeply foundational to how we live out our lives, our beliefs, and our Christian principles, since we are speaking as a church. What became obvious in our community, in our neighborhood, was that the people who were now living in our neighborhood were not people who were independently wealthy. Many of them did not have multiple cars or even any car at all. We began to notice that where there had never been, we're in the suburbs, where there had never been public transportation stops in our area, there was now one right down the street from the church, where the people who had raised their children in that area remembered family restaurants and skating rinks and daycares. Indeed, we even had one at the church, and opportunities for families to gather together, to bowl, playgrounds for the children. They noticed that all of those things had either been closed down or replaced by check cashing opportunities, payday loan places, pawn shops. Family restaurants were now replaced with fast food options. Grocers had left the area. And these things happened so gradually that if you are one who only comes in to visit, it is understandable how those things might miss your view. In these conversations with one another, where we began to share our stories, stories of why we moved into that area, stories of why we left that area, stories of those that we were meeting for the first time and who were meeting us for the first time, we began to form a different kind of community. And for a complete month at Christ the King, which is the name of the church that I pastor, I preached every Sunday from a theme called "The Door of the Church is Open." In Black culture, it is our habit, no matter what denomination you're in, to open the door of the church after the sermon is preached. It is a public invitation to those who are listening to form and shape a relationship with Jesus Christ at the urging of the church and, of course, at the urging of the pastor. There are many denominations, including the one I currently serve, the United Church of Christ, where that is not common practice, where the invitation to join church is given and then people are invited to exercise that invitation on their own. But in our church, we continue the cultural practice of reserving time in every worship service for people to make a public declaration that they wanted a change in their lives. And based on that invitation, which always says the door of the church is open, not the doors, not the physical doors of the church, but the door to a relationship with Jesus Christ, I did a sermon series where I challenged the members of Christ the King to decide whether or not we really meant that invitation from our hearts when we extended. Beyond the spiritual necessity of that invitation, did we really mean that we were willing to open the doors of our church to those who were now members of our surrounding community, most of whom had not even visited Christ the King in the time that they had been there? We made a decision that the answer to that question was yes. And the answer to that question being yes meant that we had to accept that the people who entered our doors may not look like us, may not speak the same primary language that we speak, may not have the same education that we have, may not drive the same kind of cars that we drive, may not drive at all, may not come with resources to benefit the church, but may come with needs that the church must help with. They may not understand our polity, our doctrine, our theology, but if they wanted to be a part of us, we made a decision that we would say yes. Not only to membership on Sunday, but to membership available throughout the week. So there were people in our neighborhood who became a part of our church who were not members of Christ the King on Sunday, who were members of other churches on Sunday, but we considered them a part of our family for the rest of the week because this is where they lived. And we began to open the doors of the church, not just for worship, but for neighborhood meetings, and to give space free of charge to people in the neighborhood who had gifts, skills, abilities, dreams, visions, but no resources to make those come to life. We offered free space to incubate those opportunities as long as they would allow people in the neighborhood to participate free of charge. In this arrangement, we did such things as incubate catering businesses, open a girls' mentoring program, a computer lab, a robotics class, dance classes for the young people, all on the property of the church, and none of it run by the church. Let me say that the membership of Christ the King at the time was about 50 people. It wasn't that we could do this work ourselves, but we certainly believed that God had given us this space for us to be an active part of this neighborhood. And this is where I fell in love with the telling of story. So why I come to you today with story is because I've come to understand, as one of my colleagues, Only Love Austin, who lives in New York, says, behind every form of oppression is a lie that we agree with, either overtly or covertly, in order to make it effective. Behind every form of oppression is a lie that we agree with, either overtly or covertly, in order to make it effective. Often these lies are couched in the stories we've been told and the stories we tell about ourselves and about others. We know these stories not only historically and culturally, but theologically as well. Some we have inherited, and some we have constructed based on our own experiences. These stories ground us, and these stories distort us. These stories shape our understanding of people, of places, of moments in time. And for our time together today, I'd simply like to begin by exploring the power of story. This morning, I'll share a story with you, and I will invite you to share stories with one another in small breakout sessions. I want to say in this space, I am making some assumptions. I wish that I were with you in person so that we could hear all the assumptions you might be making. But I am making the assumption that as much Zoom time as we spend together, if you willingly showed up this morning to spend an hour and a half on Zoom with me at 9:30 your time, and perhaps an hour and a half on Zoom with me later on this afternoon, that you did so because you wanted to be here. I'm making an assumption that no one twisted your arm, that your salary is not impacted if you don't show up, that you're not trying to impress anyone because you could put your picture up and not be there. We know all the Zoom tricks, right? I'm assuming that you are here because you want to be here. And with that assumption, I am assuming that you have a genuine interest in digging a little bit deeper into the breaches in our society, in our churches, and that you have a genuine interest in helping to restore and repair the streets, as the prophet Isaiah says, that we are to dwell in. I also ask that you make an assumption about me, that I am here because I want to be here, that I am here, yes, by invitation, but that it is an invitation that I took with great delight. And I'm going to assume that as we begin to talk and as we begin to share stories, if there are things that may be alarming to others, that may be hurtful even to some, that any kind of comments in that direction are made not for the intention of being hurtful or harmful, but because perhaps there is some learning to occur there. During the course of this day, I may use words that are charged in this time in our society. I want you to understand what I mean when I use those words. When I talk about white privilege, I am talking about the unearned, unseen, and most often unrequested benefits that are afforded to people in the United States and beyond simply because of the color of their skin. I am not suggesting that people ask for those benefits or in any way or always even aware that they are happening. But in our society, because of the stories we tell, assumptions are made about entire groups of people based on the color of their skin. If I use the term white supremacy, I am talking about the consciousness of those privileges and the wielding intentionally of them to exert power over others. That is what I mean by those phrases. As other phrases come up in our conversation, I will certainly be willing. And if I forget, please ask me exactly what do you mean when you say that? It is fortuitous, my friends, that we are gathering this weekend under an overarching Hebrew text that largely tells a story of God's intention for the people of Israel. The Israelites in the text in Isaiah that we will be using all weekend are in the midst of Babylonian captivity. And as we walk through this text, began to get a glimpse of what God has in store for them on the other side of this captivity. I'm intrigued by this because this too is a story. Indeed, our sacred text, and yes, it is sacred, is a collection of story. At its core, it is the recording of a people's relationship with God. And what makes it holy for me is that I can see my relationship with God reflected in the experiences that are recorded there. I want to be transparent and acknowledge that for me, as holy and as sacred as I do hold the text that I preach, and I preach it with belief, I view the Bible as a people's book about a holy God and not God's book about a holy people. I'm going to say that again. I view the Bible. I am not asking that you view what I view, but I want to be transparent. I view the Bible as a people's book about a holy God and not God's book about a holy people. It is sacred because of the truths that it holds. And those truths have worn and borne the test of time. And the difference I am making in defining it in this way is that when I understand that this is a story recorded by people who had interactions with the God I serve, but is not God's ultimate choice of whom is chosen and who is not, then I can see myself in God's story that is ever revealing and ever being unfolded. It makes my journey with God sacred as well. And it makes your journeys with God sacred as well. And helps us to create a container that will never be large enough to hold all of whom God is, but that will be large enough to hold our stories and our encounters as sacred as well. We have been shaped by this text And we have been shaped by the telling of this text. We have been shaped by the way we learned it in Sunday school if we were a part of that narrative. We've been shaped by the preaching of this text in ways that have enriched us and in ways that often sometimes challenge us. Even as we watch the division in our country right now, not just the political division, but the religious division, the theological division, I am often caught off guard by how so many people can read and reverence the same book and come out with different interpretations and different meanings. The reason that is possible is because of the stories we hold. We hold those stories in tension with historical narratives that we have inherited, familiar narratives that we have inherited, cultural narratives that we have inherited. And all of these come together to shape and form who we are in this moment. I want to tell you a story. And after I tell my story, I want to invite you to go into breakout rooms where there'll be only about 5 of you in each session and share a story of your own, of similar theme. The story I want to tell you today lingers with me even as I am now 57 years old. It is something that happened to me in high school. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm a child of the 60s. I was born in the heart of an area embroiled in the civil rights movement. My parents were not ones who marched in the streets. My mother and my father always said they did not have the self-control to do that, and they knew it. So they contributed financially to the movement. And for whatever reasons they chose, they really didn't expose me to a lot of what was happening when I was younger. That was possible in Birmingham because Birmingham was still segregated at the time, largely. And so while there were places that we might go where there was integration, we lived largely in Black neighborhoods that were not all the same. There were some neighborhoods that had more wealth than others, but largely Black people lived with Black people and white people lived with white people and brown people lived with brown people, though that was not as large of a segment of my growing up. By the time I got to 3rd grade, I attended a private Catholic school that was largely Black students, even though most of the teachers and the priests and the nuns were white. I loved that school. And because I lived in community with Black people, I also lived in community with many of my teachers, many principals in the area. My orthodontist lived up the street. My pediatrician lived around the corner. It was these kinds of neighborhoods. The consequence of that was I went to school with my kindergarten teacher every morning. That was both a gift and a burden. Whenever I was behind on schoolwork or slacking off at school, you didn't have the luxury of creating your own story when you got home because my kindergarten teacher would come to the front door and give a report. And if there was extra work to be done in any class, myself, along with some other people who lived in the neighborhood who also rode with Mrs. Hill, that was her name, to school every morning, would find out, much to our chagrin on our ride home, that we would not be going straight home, but we would be going to her house so that she could help us with our work. By the time I was in third grade, Mrs. Hill came over and spoke with my parents and told them that she was concerned because I was spending too much time in school helping other children, that she thought that this class was not challenging enough for me, and that my parents should put me in another school. And she had a school that she recommended. I didn't know any of this. It was a private school on the other side of town. The other side of the town, meaning a school where no one looked like me. My mother told me during the summer that I was going to take a test just so that people could know I was smart. That was a trick that always worked with me. I always wanted people to think I was smart. And so I took this test and I passed it, never heard anything else about it, was expecting to go back to my school when school started. We got close and I asked Mom about my uniforms for the year. And she said, "Oh, don't worry. Everything will be okay." It was not until the first day of school when my mom said, "I'm not going with Mrs. Hill. She was taking me to school that day," did I learn that I was not going back to my beloved class. My mom drove me to the other side of town. She did not walk me to class. She pulled up to what was another new experience for me, a carpool, and the safety patrol opened the door. My mom pointed to the back seat and said, "Those books are yours. This is your new school. Have a great day." I got out. I went into this school, and it is my first recollection of knowing that I was different. I know that sounds odd. I shared with you that the teachers in my other school were white, but I literally never thought about it until I walked into a school where I saw no one that was my skin color. Someone helped me to the fourth grade class where I met my new classmates and my teacher. And in this class, I was the only Black person. It was a shock for me, and judging by the interactions with my classmates, it was a shock for them. I began to hear questions like, "What color is your blood? Can I touch your hair? Where do you live?" Not questions of maliciousness per se, but questions of curiosity between children who had never been exposed to the other. This was fourth grade. From that class until college, I was never in a class with another Black student. And it wasn't until seminary that I had the opportunity of having a teacher that looked like me again. In high school, I was in a school with 32 seniors. It was a private school, and we spent much of our time preparing for the next leg of our journey. In our sophomore year, the entire class was taken on a trip to visit the Ivy Leagues on the East Coast. In our junior year, we did the Southern Ivies. In our senior year, those schools we were interested in would come to speak to us. It is this part of the story I want to tell you. I was quite competent in the school. I wasn't challenged beyond the challenges of ordinary students. I made good grades. I was involved in extracurricular activities. I sang in the touring concert choir. On those visits to colleges, there were colleges I was interested in and colleges that I was not interested in. On the East Coast trip, we had visited Harvard. I was not particularly interested in Harvard. I just didn't like the air of the atmosphere of the campus. I'll say that. It's a wonderful school, just not for me. On this senior visit, the Harvard representative came to our school. He talked in much the way they talked on the campus to let us know that Harvard was a school of exceptional students, that all the students could have a 4.0 and extracurricular activities if they so choose to have a class that way. And if we didn't have a 4.0, there was no need for us to apply. Immediately following that session, we had a private reception with cookies and punch so that people who were interested in Harvard could speak with the recruiter. I was not interested, so I made a beeline for the cookies and punch table. But the recruiter followed me, and he asked, was I interested in attending Harvard? I said to him, of course I am. It was a lie, but it was a polite lie. What were you gonna say? When I said that, he said to me, well, you heard everything I said to the class, but that doesn't apply to you. If you can maintain a C average in this school, you can go to Harvard. It was in that moment that I realized that he did not see me and would never see me, and made a decision that would probably be a part of my life. I'm hearing that we're having a difficulty. If you'll give me one moment, I think they're fixing something. I'll be right back. Can you hear me? I have a message that I need to pause. Can you hear me?
Yes, Tracy, we can hear you. We're having some difficulty with the meeting room controls, and so at the end of your story, as we're before we go into breakout rooms, I'd ask everyone that we take actually a 5 or 10 minute break, and then have everyone rejoin us to go into the breakout room. I'm sorry for that difficulty.
That's okay. Thank you. I understood in that moment that what that recruiter saw was the color of my skin and the assumptions and the stories that go with the color of my skin from his perception. He could not conceive. It was inconceivable to him that I could be in this school because I deserved to be there. It was inconceivable to him that I could actually make the grades, which I was doing, that would have qualified me to be at Harvard. Indeed, I had been accepted to Princeton, to Swarthmore, to Yale, to Dartmouth, to all the schools that I had interest in. At 57 years old, that story still stays with me. And I wonder, when people see me, I wonder even when I'm able to accomplish things, whether people see it as an exception, as a fluke, or as what is to be expected of me. I wonder, do people see me or see only the color of my skin? This story, which I know that recruiter meant no harm by, this story has shaped a part of my life, shaped my framings and my suspicions. And I guess I really told you a couple of stories, because to realize that one can go, I can go, the majority of my educational life and not be in a class with someone who looks like me and not be taught by people who look like me. is a story that also has an impact on who I become. I would like for you to be courageous enough in your breakout session. You will have 30 minutes, so you'll have plenty of time to get to know one another if you don't, just on the surface. I'm just teasing about that. State that you will assume that one another is sharing because you want to be here. And I'm going to ask that if you are comfortable, if you will share a time in your life when you became intimately aware of your race. How did you feel? How did that moment impact you? What other narratives or stories were at play in that moment? Are there insights you've gained from that moment? And perhaps insights you might gain from listening to one another. I ask you to do this with a few ground rules, if you would allow. We would form these together if we could, but we're not in person, so you have to trust me. I want you to respect that each person's story is their own, and that the story is not shared for you to fix, or for you to apologize, or for you to make better, or for you to make worse. Receive one another's story as a gift, as an opportunity to get to know someone from a different angle, not to judge and not to justify. I ask you to listen and to also respect that even when a story is shared, it still belongs to the person who told the story. Can we do that? I ask when you get in your small breakout groups that you choose someone to be a recorder, not of the stories in particular, but of the conversation that you may have as you share stories. And when we come back together, we will open up the Zoom so that we can dialogue about it. Dialogue about what the sharing of stories may have meant or not meant to you. Whether it caused you to be inquisitive about some things that you may not have been before. Whether there are new insights gained, or whether there are new frontiers that we might explore together. This afternoon, for those of you who return, I will tell the story of race in this country. And we will talk about how that story has impacted us all, knowingly and unknowingly. But for now, our personal stories. I think I'm hearing that we're going to take about 5 minutes. Am I correct about that?
Yes. We're going to take 5 or so minutes of break. I'm actually going to ask everyone to log out of the meeting during those 5 minutes and return.
Okay.
We can reset the controls and the recording for this meeting. Okay, I thank you everyone for your patience.
So it is 9:17 now. Do you want to just make it easy and say maybe 9:25?
Yes, that sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Right.